It's Game Boy World, and this is Lock and Chase. After our excursion into the exceptional mercenary force in Gargoyle's Quest, it's a little tough to revert back to Game Boy business as usual. To be fair though, Lock and Chase isn't some lackadaisical puzzle wannabe affair. It's a puzzle wannabe affair with history. In fact, the story of Lock and Chase goes back nearly a decade to December of 1980, when Data East introduced a revolutionary new concept in arcade game distribution to the Japanese market, the Deco system. I stated in the tennis episode of Good Intentions that the Nintendo Versus system helped innovate the idea of arcade hardware built around inexpensive, interchangeable software, and it's true. But just as Nintendo's design for tennis was seemingly ripped straight from Data East's Super Doubles Tennis, so too was the Versus system, for which Tetris was the freshman release, lifted from the Data East Corporation as well. Apparently, Nintendo had a creepy stalker thing going with the other company. The Deco system existed as the predecessor to Nintendo's Versus system. The idea was essentially the same. Arcade vendors could buy into the Deco family by purchasing a cabinet built around interchangeable games, and once the current software module had run its course and no longer made money, they could replace it with a different game without the need to buy an entirely new cabinet. Given that the materials, electronics, warehousing, and freight involved in the distribution of bulky cabinets comprised the majority of expenses for the arcade biz, being able to switch in a new game title with nothing more than a replacement module and a fresh set of marquee stickers had obvious appeal for vendors who counted their profits in loose change. The Deco system ultimately played host to nearly 50 different games between 1980 and 1984, making it a bigger success than Nintendo's derivative system and nearly as enduring as the PlayChoice 10 line. What really makes the Deco system fascinating is that the entire setup revolves around tape cassettes. Yes, the world's most fragile and unreliable data distribution format improbably became the linchpin of Data East's arcade business. Thankfully, the Deco architecture didn't involve constant tape loading the way home computers like the ZX Spectrum and Coleco Atom did. The machine would dump the game entirely into RAM upon startup, so that after the initial boot, there was no additional wait time and no needless wear on the delicate magnetic tape. The Deco system ultimately brought a whole lot of forgotten games into the world, including a great many that never left Japan. But it also gave us Super Doubles Tennis. And then there were the legitimate Golden Era classics like Bump and Jump and future Game Boy World subject Burger Time. Right there among the Deco hits, Data East produced a little game called Lock and Chase. Like many games produced in 1981, Lock and Chase shamelessly ripped off Namco's Pac-Man. Pac-Man, of course, was a classic game of conquering territory, a manic chase in which players attempted to cover every inch of a maze and mark their claim to those spaces by consuming the dots placed throughout the screen. The maze element wasn't as essential to Pac-Man's innate character as the idea of claiming territory, which is a distinct and much more addictive task. There is, after all, a reason everyone imitated Pac-Man rather than its maze chase contemporary Rally X, which was really just about hunting for a few items in the maze. That being said, most attempts to ride the Pac-Man bandwagon ultimately manifested as maze chases, the pursuit of someone else's megabucks being such a literal affair. And Lock and Chase was one of those aggressively literal Pac-Man knockoffs. It dressed up Namco's smash hit with a cops and robbers theme, but otherwise did very little to stray from the source material. The player's character, a thief named Lupin — no, sorry, not that one, although this is certainly a better game than Arsène III got back in the day — Lupin dashes through a maze collecting dots, which are coins in this case, while avoiding 4 patrolmen with different patterns of behavior. Does it sound familiar? Lock and Chase differentiates itself from Pac-Man with 2 factors. 1, the tunnels between sides of the maze don't always appear in the same place, and often show up along horizontal edges as well as vertical, allowing you more escape options from the cops. That's good, because the other difference is that you lack Pac-Man's energizers to turn the tables on the bad guys. Instead, you have to rely on passive traps. Trapping changes the nature of Lock and Chase considerably. Most paths within the maze contain small, matched protrusions poking out from the walls. By pressing the action button, you can cause a barrier to appear between the most recent set of protrusions Lupin has passed through. These temporary barriers create an obstruction that the cops can't pass through. And if you somehow manage to trap a pursuer between 2 walls, you earn a tiny bonus. This is more easily said than done, but at the very least, the barriers offer players a little room to breathe and go after the special treasures that appear in the center of the maze after you collect a set amount of coins. All in all, this was one of the best Pac-Man clones we saw back in the day. That said, Lock and Chase was nearly a decade old by the time it arrived on Game Boy. Was there really a place for a dated Pac-Man wannabe on handheld systems in 1990? Personally, I say no, and thankfully, so did Data East. Lock and Chase for Game Boy is no mere port of the arcade game. It's a top-to-bottom overhaul that adds new elements, new mechanics, and a steady sense of progression to the action. This is, for all intents, Lock and Chase 2, and it's pretty good. The arcade game consisted of a single maze whose fine details changed from stage to stage, but otherwise just repeated infinitely in slightly more difficult iterations until it became impossible to go any further. On Game Boy, however, every maze is different from the last. The cops appear in different permutations as well. Rather than all four showing up straight away in level 1, you'll initially face 2, then 3, all the way up to 5 or 6. There are 4 different types of cops, but more than one of the same version can appear in a given level, and each has a considerably more distinct behavior pattern than they did in the arcade. The game breaks its 18 stages into 6 worlds with 3 levels apiece. There's more to this organization format than digestibility though. Each world introduces a new mechanic. The first level of a world tends to be fairly simple, allowing you to come to grips with a new gameplay element. The second is a standard level, a decent challenge, and the third and final stage in each world puts your skills to the test with a devious maze that makes maximal use of that world's gimmick. The Game Boy version retains the door trapping mechanic of the arcade game, but here it becomes more versatile. The mazes feature far more complex and varied layouts than the fixed arcade arrangement, meaning you can make more sophisticated use of that ability. It's also much easier here to lock cops between 2 gates, as unlike in the arcade version, the maze isn't a simple series of T-intersections. Since you're limited to having 2 trap walls on the screen at a time, you can only trap enemies in the corners of the arcade maze. Here though, the more complex screen layouts allow you to capture them far more frequently, and in greater numbers. In a way, Lock and Chase presaged what Nintendo would do with its Donkey Kong port to Game Boy in 1994. It begins playing like a fairly faithful rendition of the ancient arcade original, but after the first world goes off in its own direction to create an entirely new experience. The second world introduces automatic doors that open and then close again after a brief delay when you press against them, which gives them tactical value. The cops can't activate them, but they also require advanced planning due to the pause in their activation. Later stages include switches that cause cops to alternately become active and harmless, sleeping cops that will only awaken if you bump into an alarm clock, and doors that warp you around the stage. Some of the underlying mechanics change up considerably for this version of the game. Treasures appear progressively as you clear the maze, just as in the arcade game, but now when you collect a bag of cash, it temporarily stuns the cops, who freeze in place and weep momentarily. Meanwhile, the less common diamond treasure works an awful lot like Pac-Man's Energizer. Grab a diamond and Lupin briefly becomes invincible, knocking cops out of the action and back to their default positions by bumping into them. If you were to add diamonds to the arcade version of Lock and Chase, it would complete the game's transformation into faux Pac-Man and come across as the ultimate expression of creative bankruptcy. But since the rest of the Game Boy game has been radically overhauled, the diamonds become part of a larger tapestry of changes that simply make this a different creation altogether than the old Deco system release. If there's a criticism to be levied against Lock and Chase, it's that the game feels decidedly brief. With only 18 stages and infinite continues, you don't really need to master the game, and you can blast through it in an hour or so. The only real challenge comes at the end, when the final stage throws out the rules of the game and becomes, perhaps inevitably, a Sokoban clone. It's Game Boy, no one's safe from Boxel. So the final stage sees Lupin pushing a giant key to unlock a vault where a massive diamond is kept. You only have to deal with 2 cops, but they wander the maze erratically, and any contact with them resets the key's location and forces you to start all over again. While I tend to find final stages that switch up play mechanics pretty annoying, I don't really mind it here. Even though pushing doesn't appear anywhere else in the game, the final level of Lock and Chase feels consistent with what's come before. And there's really no more appropriate way to put a capper on a Game Boy game than with yet another Sokoban clone, right? Then, once you complete the game, you discover the secret surprise. You're only halfway through. Lock and Chase gets its own equivalent of the inverted castle, with a second set of hidden stages that doubles the length of the game and really amps up the difficulty level. The code that appears after the in-credits roll unlocks 18 more stages designed to destroy overconfident players. So then, even my one big complaint about the game is moot. Lock and Chase is far more audacious and ambitious than it had any right to be. And while it's probably not at the top of anyone's list of favorites, it's definitely one of the better games of this type to have appeared on the platform. As with all the best Game Boy releases, Lock and Chase was developed internally rather than being outsourced by Data East to some contractor. The designers and programmers credited here also worked on other Data East creations, such as B-Wings, Side Pocket, Bad Dudes, and RoboCop. Believe me, I know better than anyone the existential weariness surrounding the endless glurge of puzzlers and maze games that bogged down Game Boy in its early years, but Lock and Chase is a cut above. Its creative design, combined with its unique history, make for a game that deserves consideration. If you've got to play a handheld puzzler, it might as well be this one. For more surprisingly worthy ports of ancient games, keep watching Game Boy World. As always, Game Boy World is made possible by support through Patreon and through book sales. Thanks for watching, and please check GameBoyWorld.com to see how you can help me track down classic Game Boy software and packaging for archives. Next time, things get a little rocky.